Hello again, I'm Alister McGrath and I'm the Andreas Idris Professor of Science and Religion at Oxford University. This is the second of a series of presentations really exploring the relation of science and faith, trying to map a landscape to help you get a sense of your bearings and allow you to explore this in your own time and in your own way. I'll be looking at a range of themes and issues which I think you'll find stimulating and interesting. And these are very informal presentations. I'm just talking to the camera about what I think is interesting. And in this second presentation, I want to talk about how I myself became interested in the field and the personal journey of discovery that actually led me to this professorship at Oxford University. Now, when I was young, I wanted to study medicine. And my father was a doctor, my mother was a nurse. I think it was just the obvious thing for me to do. And knowing my career plans, my great uncle, who was head of pathology at one of Ireland's leading teaching hospitals, gave me an old brass microscope. And I still have that microscope because it was so important to me in terms of my career trajectory. And it was manufactured in Germany back in 1903. And it had been my great uncle's since he had bought it as a medical student back in Belfast. And this microscope became for me a gateway to loving nature, wanting to understand nature, which actually remains with me to this day. And shortly afterwards, I began to look at the night sky through a telescope, and I was overwhelmed by the sight of the moons of the planet Jupiter and the rich star fields of the Milky Way. And the telescope enabled me to see things that had always been there, but I couldn't see them unaided. And it seemed to me as if I was standing on the brink of a vast ocean of truth and had caught a fleeting glimpse of something at its distant end. Now, I'm sure many of you have had an experience like that. Obviously, it leads to science. I want to understand this strange and beautiful world. But it's also a gateway to religious experience. When I was studying science at high school back in the 1960s, I was an atheist. I have to say I regarded religion as being outdated superstition that evaded any serious engagement with evidence or with critical question. And it just seemed to me that religion was simply all about blind faith. It was a refusal to actually think seriously about our world. But, although I loved science as a teenager, I actually had a sense it wasn't complete. It helped us to understand how things worked, sure, but what did they mean? I think science gave me a very neat answer to the question of how I came to be in the world, but it didn't really answer another question I had, which is, why was I here? What's the purpose of life? What's the purpose of my life? And these seemed to me to be real and important questions, but there were ones I think that science couldn't answer. I couldn't look through my microscope and find an answer to that question. So when I was 16, I decided that loving natural sciences meant I had to be an atheist, a committed atheist. And to understand my line of thought here, you need to understand that back in the 1960s, the narrative of the relation of science and religion was dominated by what we now call the warfare narrative. If you're a scientist, you're at war with religion. And that's the way I thought. I love science, so I guess I have to hate religion. Now, as I shall explain to you in the next presentation, this narrative is now known to be decidedly unreliable, and there are much more positive and helpful and reliable ways of thinking about the relation of science and faith. Now, in my own case, I first discovered the imaginative and the rational power of religious belief when I was studying a natural science at Oxford. And I discovered, to my surprise, I have to say, that Christianity enabled me to see our world in a new way. And that, I think, made me want to bring these two ways of thinking together. I used in the previous presentation the idea of stereoscopic vision. Here's one lens, here's another lens, we look through them both, and we see nature in more detail and greater depth than either of them allow us on our own. It brings together the two great themes of how our universe functions and what it means. Now, when I was a teenager, I used to enjoy reading works by the American novelist Henry Miller. He's a great writer, and I found I really warmed to the way he saw life as a kind of chaotic and fragmented journey. And here's a quote from him about the purpose of life and journeying. He says, "Our destination is never a place, but rather a new way of looking at things. And I really like that, the idea of discovering this new way of looking at things. I think that is actually very, very important for all of us. It certainly was for me. And although Western culture, I think, at the time was dominated by the idea that science and faith are at war, I began to realize there was a new way of looking at things, that they could, in effect, enrich each other, give me stereoscopic vision. And that was really the gateway to the field in which I now work. So for me, religious belief fills in the detail of a big picture, which science is a major part. Let's be clear about that, a major part, but nevertheless only a part. And really we need to see the full big picture if we're going to make sense of the big questions of life. And you know, science, ethics, politics, religion, they're all different, but that does not mean they are incompatible. We need to find a way of weaving these together to give a meaningful and fulfilling way of thinking about the world and ourselves. And Einstein is one of many scientists who make the point that all of these illuminate different aspects of our lives and our world. Now, since then, I've spent most of my professional career at Oxford University as an academic with this special interest in the relationship between science and religious belief. And it's great being able to look at these two themes in really great detail. But you know, earlier in this presentation, I talked a bit about this idea that science and religion are at war with each other. And sure, that's what most people thought back in the 1960s, but I have to say, not now. Things have moved on. Scholarship has really looked at these questions in much greater detail, and I have to tell you, it's been debunked and dismantled by serious historical scholarship. We now know there is no right or self-evidently true way of looking at the relationship between science and religion. We have lots of options. We have to choose. So I look forward to seeing you again soon, when we're going to look at the rise and then the fall of this warfare myth, and then we'll move on and look at some much more interesting and productive ways of thinking about the relation of science and religion. So thank you so much for listening, and goodbye from Oxford.